So let's get going. Before I'm going to ask you a question that I haven't asked before, and you guys can just shout out what you want. And probably next time I'll tell you what the academic consensus is on what you have to say about this stuff. But first of all, who is Paul? Just tell me one detail that you know or think about Paul. And I need probably like 5.
Persecutor of the church, early church.
He was a tutor, you said?
Persecutor.
A persecutor. He says he was. The issue is there was no Christianity at that point. So what was he exactly persecuting? And more importantly, why was he persecuting? There is a lot of disagreement on why he was persecuting.
So he's a Pharisee?
He was a Pharisee. Says he was a Pharisee. He says he was born a Pharisee, and he died a Pharisee. And so if that's true, what is it about? What was he converting from, and what was he converting to? So just to think about it. 2 things. Anybody else?
We think he was from Tarsus.
Preacher.
He was a preacher. He thought of himself as the term he uses is, he says apostle, but probably a better idea is messenger. And he was a messenger to whom? Gentiles. Acts says he started in the synagogues. His own writings, he doesn't discuss that, but he does say he was whipped on with 39 lashes on a number of occasions, and that was a Jewish punishment. So Jews were punishing him for some reason, but for what? Okay. Next, anybody else have an idea? You said another one, Connor, didn't you?
Well,
No.
they say he's from Tarsus, that's questionable.
Right, and so he's clearly not from Jerusalem, and you're saying that comes from Acts, and we have this conflict occasionally, which is Acts gives pretty much the life of Paul. Acts is written by Luke, right? So Luke writes Luke and then Acts, and he tells a story, and sometimes what he writes doesn't agree with what Paul writes. And next time I'll tell you what to do when those 2 things conflict. Hint, believe Paul when he's talking about Paul, for the most part, okay? But not always, because sometimes he gets rowdy, and the things that we don't talk about in church, he's crude. I think I've mentioned this to you several times. He says on a couple of occasions about people who want to circumcise Gentiles who are Christ followers. He says, I hope they slip with their knife and do some damage to themselves. I think the new NRSV says emasculate, but whatever. I mean, that's Paul. So he gets excited and angry about some of this stuff. So what else? Go ahead.
He was a Roman citizen.
He said in Acts it says he's a Roman citizen. He never says it, but that's he says he uses that for particular reasons. For the most part, the academic consensus has been very negative about Acts for the last 10 years. But there's a new book coming out that's not out now that's going to make an opposite argument. It's by a renowned scholar, so I'm interested in seeing what he has to say on this. So, in my mind, I sometimes have to separate. This is what Acts says about him, and I try to see if he agrees with what it has to say. But, the framing of Acts is important, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, because Acts has a particular understanding of who Paul is, and I think it's something that we should be aware of, and it should affect what we think. Go ahead.
He required Timothy, his traveling buddy, to be circumcised because he was a Jew.
He did, and that's an issue, and this is a whole discussion we'll have, so we'll get to that. Before we go on, I did forget one thing. Go ahead.
Oh, he had a conversion experience.
Right, which is again a different thing. He tells us a conversion experience 3 times in Acts. They don't always agree, but the general outline's the same. In Galatians, he talks about the fact that he was converted, but he doesn't give the details. But he does say in 1 Corinthians 15 that he had a personal experience of Jesus, which led him to change what he was thinking. But again, we used the word conversion before. Was it a conversion experience? if he was a Jew at the beginning of his life and was a Jewish person at the end of his life. Is it or is it not? So we'll discuss that. Part of the reason I'm excited about this class and the next class is for the last 20 years, I've been deeply, deeply concerned and concerned about this issue. And just recently, I think I'm starting to understand who Paul is. I don't understand him completely, but this class will touch on some of the things that that I'm excited about. So, and again, if you find something troubling or disagree, or you want some elaboration on it, just let me know as we're going along. Before we do that, almost once a month or once every couple of months, I'm asked a question repeatedly by people here at St. Matthew's. That is, what's the best Bible I should be reading? I've changed my mind in the last couple of weeks on something, and actually went and bought this. This is my new answer. It's called the SBL Study Bible. It used to be called the HarperCollins Study Bible. The SBL is the Society of Biblical Literature. It's the top scholars in America have put together this, lots of notes. It's got articles in it that are helpful. I was just reading one this morning on a Korean perspective on Proverbs, which is something you're not going to find in many Bibles, and how it's different from our own understanding. But there are articles throughout the thing. There are no pictures, unfortunately. I like Bibles with pictures and archaeology and stuff. That's not in there. But the notes are good. I use on my phone. I use the what's the app I use for the Bible? For anytime I'm using the Bible for readings in church, I use an app, and you can take the Harper Study Bible notes and put it at the bottom, just like on your, just like in here. So frequently I read through, but they have not updated with the SBL Study Bible. But if anybody would be interested in look at it, I've got it up front. So go ahead.
Yeah, I've got the HarperCollins now. Does yours have there's some Apocrypha in it?
It's great.
And then
it's awesome. It's got not just the official Apocrypha, but it's got other things in there, like books that are in the Dead Sea Scrolls that aren't in the Old Testament, New Testament. For instance, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there aren't 150 Psalms, there are 151 Psalms. But they weren't really, the people who put together the Old Testament wanted a good, clean number. The people at Qumran didn't care about that. They just collected Psalms, and so they've got the 151st Psalm in there.
And then for the 4 Gospels, mine has where you can see what it says in the verse for each one, where it's a comparative.
Yeah.
And
You can on the app, you can't on, they'll point it to you on that sort of stuff. If you're interested in that, there is one particular book that's really good for parallel studies where you can look and see. We know, what was the first gospel written? Does anyone know? Mark was written, and then Matthew took Mark and wrote his story. Luke took Mark and wrote his story. You can see in this where Matthew took portions of Mark and changed them, added to them, or dropped them. For instance, in Mark 3, there's an incident where I think the best translation, and it's there in Mark, is someone came and wanted to be healed. It's been a long day, and the best translation is acting with anger, Jesus heals him. That becomes in Mark it says that. In Matthew it becomes acting with compassion, Jesus heals him. So you have to figure out which one's right. And which one, but it's an interesting thing. But yeah, that's in there. The other one I usually tell people they should look at is this also has the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. They've updated the NRSV for several Bibles that are going on. And if you go online and you're looking for a translation, do the NRSV UE, which is the updated edition. So let's start talking about Paul. Last time we talked about problems with Paul. I don't know if you remember this. It's been a few months. I mentioned that some people, a number of people consider him homophobic. We talked about this earlier this year, about particularly Romans 1, 18 through 32. One thing to remember is when he's talking about this, and he says that people have been turned over to their passions and men are having sex with other men, women. are having sex with other women. He's not talking about Jews in that section. This whole section is about how horrible Gentiles are, and this is what they're prone to do. And so just a reminder, that whole section is, it's an interesting argument. In Romans 1, he's saying, you people are Christ-following Jews. This is how horrible you guys are, and then you need to move away from that. And then he tricks them in the second chapter. He says, well, actually, Jewish people are also have problems too. And then he says, all of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So he ends up saying, well, we all have issues. It's not just the Gentiles who I'm talking to, but Jewish people have this issue too. But we'll talk today about Paul the anti-Semite, Paul the apologist for slavery, another topic that he writes about that we just ignore and we've decided to pass on. Something that we didn't ignore, we fought a war over this sort of stuff, and a guy named David Noel wrote the Civil War as a theological debate, and he tracks the debate that went on over slavery there. Paul the xenophobe, which I haven't touched on, but it is an interesting and important topic. And then this last time I talked about Paul as the misogynist. And here's some other people who've been very critical of Paul over the years. Thomas Jefferson, who's thought of Jesus giving us a pure message, and that Paul disagreed with that. And next time I'm going to talk a good deal about how Paul's message in the end is incredibly similar to what Jesus is. It isn't completely, but there are a great deal of similarities, something that actually surprised me. Leo Tolstoy, who thought the same thing, that he deviated from Jesus' teachings. Nietzsche, who thought that his ideas were an evil assault on refined humanity, who argued that Christians had a slave mentality and non-Christians did not. Ebionites, the early Jewish Christians, called him an apostate. And you know, the disagreements over Paul start very early on. In 2 Peter, the last book in our New Testament, in fact, in 2 Peter 3, the author of that says it's really hard to understand Paul. And that's not long after Paul was writing these things. And the Ebionites just threw him out completely. Said Paul didn't understand anything, don't use it. Yet in the year 150, there was a guy named Marcion who put together the first Bible. And his first Bible only included one gospel, Luke, and then it included Paul's letters. Except in Romans, he chopped out the end of it because it had nice things to say about Jews. And he believed there were two gods, Marcion did, that there was the Old Testament God who was evil and the New Testament God who was good. And so that was what drove him. And the church eventually rejected his ideas. But it's interesting that he's got these people like Marcion who love him and think he defines everything that's right about God and the gospel and everything, and the Ebionites who hated him and thought he was an apostate. And then finally, Bertrand Russell, who said his stuff was intellectual rubbish. And there are passages like this that we run into that are attributed to Paul. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission, and do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. Yet she will be saved through childbearing, provided they continue in faith and love and holiness with self-control. You know, I grew up a fundamentalist. This was like one of the first passages that created a huge problem for me. And I was trying to figure out how you could have a fair system where men and women operate on two different planes. And actually the best man at my wedding is now a monk at Mount Athos in Greece. And we had our falling out over Paul's writings on this stuff. It really, really created a lot of concern for me. Not so much anymore, but it did then. And what I told you was that we need to realize that Paul didn't, academic consensus again, didn't write everything that's attributed to him. For instance, 1 Thessalonians, definitely his, and definitely the first thing he wrote. 2 Thessalonians, probably not. And the greatest thing about it is, in 2 Thessalonians, the author said, beware, some people will write in my name and try to trick you, but I would never do that.
Trust me.
Some of these, like Colossians and Ephesians, people are divided on. I think they probably weren't written by him, but they're generally sympathetic to what he said and very close to what he had to say. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, not so much. So how did we get from, so what do we get from Paul? When we look at Paul's actual life compared to what some of these things say in there, in his name, we find out that 10 women are named and praised in Romans 16. He's getting ready to come there. He's not gone to Rome. And so he's saying, called out all these people and said, I can't wait to see you and you and you and you, and so forth. And he says Phoebe was a minister, a financial supporter of his. So his ministry was supported by a woman. And then he says Priscilla and Aquila were a wife and husband team who were co-workers before he was, and he learned from them. And they mentions Junia, the only female apostle named in the Bible. So he's naming all these women who are active there, preaching, spreading the gospel. That's his life. Now, I'm not trying to convince you that Paul was a progressive. He wasn't. And there are books that try to. I have one, and I brought it with me, called Paul the Progressive. Paul is not a progressive. I mean, he's still talking about slavery and how slaves should obey their masters. He says that women, again, I think that we don't follow, that women should all be wearing things on their heads when they're in church. And a number of other things. He sees the women as being secondary in a relationship. But he does accept women, and he does have passages like Galatians 3, where he says, in Christ there's neither male nor female, because in Christ we all are one, we're one body. So he did do a lot for women in his time. Not a progressive, but he's not as terrible as a lot of people say. You want that on your resume, don't you? Not as terrible. So he dies around the year 60, and this is what happens. Like Romans, he wrote before he died. That's the last book he writes. But Jesus didn't return as expected. And this is important, and I'll be talking to you about this in the next two classes. From his first letter in 1 Thessalonians, he teaches Jesus is coming any moment now, and he'll take up all of us and start his kingdom soon and judge people. To Romans, he says, we're even closer now to when Jesus is going to come. And this drives what he has to say. It affects why he says repeatedly, I want you to continue as you are now. So to the point where he doesn't even want you starting a new business. He doesn't want you suing anything, because Jesus is coming right away, and focus on that. There's only one brief reference in all of his letters to children, because he doesn't want to even think about children. Obviously, he wouldn't encourage you to buy insurance or, buy green bananas or any of that sort of stuff. Jesus is coming right away, and you better be prepared for that. But he doesn't come, so the church has to deal with that. And the Jewish and Christian communities in the year 70 part after, not completely, but somewhat after that time. And then the author of Ephesians, again, someone who's writing as Paul, puts together, this is what the household code is. This is what your family should look like, which Paul didn't really care about. He just says, stay as you are and get ready for Jesus to come. In Ephesians, he says, actually, this is how your family should be set up. It's very traditional and very much taken, patriarchal, and taken from Roman society. And then finally, you have the author of 1 Timothy that expresses male hierarchy for both the church and public life. So Paul, not so much big on that, but after he dies, other writers in his name become very interested in those things. So you remember all that. So I just thought I'd go over it and remind myself, and not you guys, what's going on. So this is today, and this is what I've been interested in, concerned about for 20 years. I've been trying to figure out and understand. And I've helped lead 4 trips to Israel, and some of you have been on these trips. And every time I go, the Jewish guides ask me a question before they start. They turn to me, and Yair, who's putting together our trip for Greece right now, asked me this question. Is your group, are they supersessionists or not? And I always tell them the same thing. They have no idea. They don't know this. They have no idea where they are there. And friends that I have frequently ask me, why are you Lutheran? This makes no sense to me. Your friends are all Lutheran. You have a lot of friends who are Lutheran. Why are you a Lutheran? And are you guys supersessionists? Again, a term you guys have never heard, or rarely have heard before. So what is it exactly? There are 2 other names for it that you might hear. One's called replacement theology, and you'll figure out in a second why it's called that. And the other one's called fulfillment theology. And this is what supersession is. It's the belief that the Christian church has replaced Judaism as God's chosen people. Okay? There's a covenant. Covenant started with Abraham, goes through Moses and David, and that covenant has been taken from the Jews and given to the Christians. And from about the 2nd century to the last century and even to today, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, and the Protestant Church has believed this. This has been a foundational point of our theology, okay? And this thing really, really bothers me. Bothers me a great deal, okay? And so I've had this problem of where do I get from what I understand about Paul to how do I change my ideas and what I think about supersessionism, okay? And I was trying to figure out where am I on this thing? Because, it's actually, I'll show you how irritating it is for us to tell Jews, you've been replaced by us. We're the ones now in God's favor. Muslims say this about us. They say, you guys have a partial story. Jesus was a prophet, but you don't get him quite right. We've got him right, and you should be following what we're saying and not doing what you're saying. Really irritating, because we say, well, you have Mary, the mother of Jesus, married to the sister of Moses. That makes no sense. That's all wrong. And they say, no, don't worry. We're right. Our Bible is divine, and yours is not. So this could be irritating, okay? Except when you're the one in charge. Then you can tell other people what they think and what they believe. Here's an even shorter version that's been given by a scholar on this point. God is done with the Jews. 2 Christians. God is done with the Jews, okay? And there are 3 different versions of this supersessionism that I'm going to tell you about. The first one's called punitive supersessionism, and I'm going to use Martin Luther. We talked about Martin Luther, who's done amazing things, tremendous things. Again, we wouldn't be here without what Martin Luther had done. Brilliant person, a brilliant musician, preacher, and a number of things, but not so good when he talks about Jewish people. And he believed that Jews were punished because they deserved it. Listen, Jew, are you aware that Jerusalem and your sovereignty, together with your temple and priesthood, have been destroyed for over 1,460 years? He would say today, whatever our date is, today minus 70 when the temple was destroyed. For such ruthless wrath of God is sufficient evidence that they assuredly have erred and gone astray. Therefore, his work of wrath is proof the Jews, surely rejected by God, are no longer his people, and neither is he any longer their God.
Whoa.
It's rough stuff, but that's a fundamental teaching, and we'll see in a second, this teaching was weaponized, okay? Not just a belief, but something that was weaponized. Economic superstition. This isn't about money, it's about how things operate. An older definition of economic. Karl Barth, one of the great theologians of the 20th century. The first Israel, constituted on the physical descent from Abraham, has fulfilled its mission now that the Savior of the world has sprung from it and its Messiah has appeared. Its mission as a natural community has now run its course and cannot be continued or repeated. So essentially, we don't need circumcision anymore. That's been replaced by baptism. We don't need kosher food laws anymore. That's been replaced by the Last Supper. We don't need the synagogue anymore. That's been replaced by the church. Okay? The Jewish people had their thing, and it served a purpose, but that's over, and we need to move on. And then another one that I find to be one of the most common kinds of supersessionism, it's structural supersessionism. And this is basically that we have a narrative of how salvation works, and we just leave out most of the Old Testament. The standard Christian narrative turns on 4 episodes. God creates the first parents, then there's the fall, Christ's incarnation and founds the church, and then there's the final consummation. This model completely neglects the Hebrew scripture with the exception of 1 through 3. God's identity as the God of Israel and his history with the Jewish people, quote, becomes largely indecisive and irrelevant for the Christian conception of God. So you just start in Genesis, you skip over everything and you start with Jesus and how you address it. And Augustine helps create that narrative. Though he respected and translated a lot of stuff from the Old Testament, he read it all not as history, but as a metaphor and analogies and stuff as reflected to the New Testament. So that becomes the framework where you skip over from the fall to this time. And I've seen this taught many times, and I went to my kids' confirmation classes here, and we frequently, in our confirmation classes, we teach original sin, Jesus, the solution to original sin, and then the church. And so that's what we need to know. So what are we leaving out and that sort of stuff? And what you make are Jewish people who this whole history belongs to. As a church, we accepted monotheism and we accepted the Old Testament. What are we leaving out by dropping that out? So, as I said, these are three different versions that exist of supersessionism or replacement theology or whatever you want to know. But when Jewish people ask me, are you supersessionists? They basically want to know, it's shorthand for saying, are these people pro-Jewish or anti-Jewish? Because that's how it's understood. And they want to know if the group that they're teaching, on one of our trips, we went to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and I told him, I had 4 different groups with me. I had a Catholic group, a Lutheran group, evangelical group, and then I would say a fundamentalist group. And after we left, one of the fundamentalists said that was entirely depressing and upsetting, but in retrospect, they deserve what they got because they turned their backs on Christ. And Yair was there, and he said, I didn't hear you right. And I said, you did. And we need to cut this off right now. But we later had a conversation about it. And I responded, if that's the God that we have who would permit the Holocaust, I'm not sure I really want to be a Christian anymore. And I just said that was really disturbing. That's why this has been bothering me for a long time. And this is in Strasbourg, and you'll find this on many churches, medieval churches. On the left here, you have synagogue. On the right, you have ecclesia. And you have a synagogue who doesn't see, is holding the law and is dropping it, and has a sword that was stuck in the side of Jesus that's been broken off. And you have over here, ecclesia, the church, radiant, can see everything, holding a chalice and a cross. And this is, in Strasbourg, they're models now. The real ones have been taken and put in a museum, but this is as you walk into the church, this is what it is. So you have, if you didn't read, this was the message that you got about Christianity and Judaism. And Timothy Jackson wrote a book 2 years ago dealing specifically with this issue. And he says, the Nazi Holocaust was the terrible price Christianity had to pay for the early church's own obscuring of moral monotheism in the Gospels by currying favor with Rome and vilifying the Jews. In trying to supersede Judaism, Christianity has betrayed its deepest identity and ideals. And a couple of years ago, I taught a class on how in Germany, the Nazi regime gave sermons to people. There's a whole operation, a Bible that removed, the Aryan Bible, removed any reference to Jesus as a Jewish person and so forth. And I could talk about that again, but the point is, this sort of idea has been used against Jewish people. And it's largely built on an understanding of who Paul is and what Paul taught. And so I want to jump into that now. And Shoah is Holocaust. Holocaust is too long for this, so I reduced it to Shoah. And so we're in a period since in the last 50 years, we've been going through in academia, but not in churches. Unfortunately, it's not happened in churches. It has happened in ELCA. The ELCA has twice apologized for Luther's teachings on Jewish people, including last year. But this isn't something that everybody was told. We weren't all asked for our contribution, but it was something that's been put out there. And there are negotiations, talks. If I were in charge, every congregation would have a partnership with a Jewish synagogue and have conversations going on about what we believe, what they believe, and so forth. But I'm not, so we don't. But there's been a post-Shoah reassessment, and it's also interesting, a new Jewish interest in who Paul is, also who Jesus is. There's some of the best stuff being written on Paul and on Jesus. Interestingly, someone like Amy Jo Levine, the head of the Christian Divinity School, Vanderbilt, Orthodox Jewish person, writing about Jesus and how does she understand him. She also has edited a Bible, New Testament, with Jewish thoughts on what's going on. And then a couple of Jewish people who've been very strongly interested in Paul. We'll meet one, Pamela Eisenbaum, and Paula Fredrickson, a number of other people too. But they've become interested and they started saying, so is what we've been told about Paul and Jesus really real, or what do they actually say? And they've made major contributions on this sort of stuff. But we'll start back with Luther and his understanding of Paul. And this is just to show his identification with Paul. He wrote this early in his ministry, even like as St. Paul was converted, just so are all others converted. For we all resist God, but the Holy Spirit draws the will of mankind when he pleases through preaching. I don't have any dispute with that, that's fine. I'm just saying, look at how he identifies himself with St. Paul. And this is true throughout his ministry. He looked back at the Bible and said, Paul was having this struggle and stuff, and what was how did he respond to it? And I've tried to, in reading through Luther, this is a distillation, I think, of a major part of his understanding of the law. One, you start off with, the conscience is a place where the law, death, and the devil encounter the human being and drive him into despair. We have an inner conflict. We have despair. We're very upset about the fact that we do things wrong and that we can't keep the law. How do we deal with this? And in his age, the way you dealt with it was through penance. You went to confession. And there's stories about how he was very afraid about this lightning storm that he was in and how it changed what he did. Even though this story might not be true, the concept was he was very concerned that he might commit a sin and be struck dead before he made it to confession. And so that was his concern, deeply, deeply upset about sin and how it affected him and whether he got to confess his sin. He claimed that the conscience is only secure if it is free from the law and totally subject to Christ. So you're only able to escape this despair when you accept Christ. And Jewish people, however, believe they can gain salvation and merit God's favor by performing the requirements of the law, Luther believed. And that's what we call works righteousness. Everybody familiar with works righteousness? You can't achieve salvation by being super good and working your way to doing there. And he believed that that's what Jewish people are going on with. The important thing to remember is, so he sees a parallel between himself and St. Paul. He has these concerns about the Catholic Church in his day and how there was penance and they were being taught what to do. There were indulgences. You were taught if you went on the Crusades, you would instantly get into heaven if you're killed. He sees this works righteousness in the Catholic Church, and he looked in the Bible and he found it in the Jewish people too. So it was Luther equals Paul, and the Catholic Church equaled Judaism. He saw those things reflected together. That he could read the situation going on in the Catholic Church in the medieval period and read about its effect in the book of Romans. And he thought that was wrong, and that Paul taught that the works righteousness was wrong. Luther argued no one can be found righteous except through God's divine grace as found in the redemptive work of Jesus Christ, which we respond to in faith, not through deeds. Okay, sound familiar? Does anybody object to that's what Paul's teaching is? Okay, and you find it mainly in Romans, but you also find it in Galatians and somewhat in 1 Corinthians. But Romans in particular, and that was his favorite book. That's what he's interested in. And in my next class, I'm going to give you my reading of Romans, not just mine, but a different reading of it. And then finally, his belief, the conclusion, legalism is the fatal weakness of Judaism. Okay, Judaism, the problem is it's a legalistic religion and therefore is not acceptable because you can't achieve salvation or God's merit through works. So to Luther, contemporary Catholicism equaled biblical Judaism. The problems in the one or the problems in the other. We'll address both of these things. Both the Paul equals Luther, Luther equals Paul, and then the contemporary Catholicism equals biblical Judaism. And we'll deal with the first one first. And this is an article, it's not an easy article, but it's something that I wish everybody who's a Lutheran could read. It's by a Lutheran bishop called Christopher Stendhal. Has anyone ever heard of him? He lived until 2008. I saw him speak at a synagogue here, an amazing guy. He wrote these 3 rules of encountering other religions and how you should do it. If you haven't seen it, you should look it up. It's very respectful. And the first one is, if you want to understand another religion, listen to someone in that religion. Don't start with its opponents or something like that. And then another one that's very important is don't compare the best of your religion with the worst of another religion, which is an easy thing to remember, but something that happens all the time. It doesn't just happen there. All you have to do is turn on talk radio any day, and you hear someone say, we believe this, and liberals think that. It's not all liberals. It's usually really bad liberals, and there are a lot of those, so it's easy to do. Christopher Stendhal, he was a bishop, but in addition to that, he was a professor at Harvard. Very brilliant guy, and he wrote this article that was major. And in fact, it wasn't originally an article. It was a speech that he gave to the American Psychological Association called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. And he read Paul in light of Luther, and he said, where is Paul's despair and his troubled conscience? Where is his being afraid of the lightning? Where is his concern about his sin life? Where is all that stuff? And when he reads Paul, this is what he finds. He finds Paul saying, if anyone else has reason to be confident in the flesh, I have more. As to the law, as Connor said, a Pharisee. As to the righteousness under the law, blameless. You can't find anywhere I've fallen short on this stuff. Okay? A couple other instances in Galatians where he repeats this sort of stuff, and in 2 Corinthians where he says some super apostles have come into his area, and he argues, don't listen to them, I'm better than they are. I follow the law, I do all this stuff, they don't. Okay? And in Galatians, his attacks on Peter, Peter, the Saint Peter, he talks about Peter being a hypocrite. He's not. There are a couple other passages, and we can talk about them later. And the main one is in Romans 7, where Paul starts writing in the first person, and he says, why is it that I want to do some things, but I can't do them. I want to achieve the law, but I can't do them. And my argument is, this is a rhetorical device. He's writing, like I told you in Romans, he first talks about how bad the Gentiles are, and then he mentions that Jews have the problem. And then he starts talking in the voice of someone that he's writing to. And he says, you believe that I do this and I can't do that. And he goes through, and then he responds to that. So it's not really Paul writing, it's Paul. When Paul's writing about himself, he's saying, I'm blameless before the law. You don't see him being very concerned about what he thinks. In his interpretation, what Stendhal believed was that Luther had read his own guilt and despair into Paul. Okay? Stendhal, the conspicuous absence of references in Paul to an actual consciousness of being a sinner is surprising. He argued that the word forgiveness is mentioned once in the authentic letters of Paul. This is just something you don't see much of. Go ahead, Connor.
So, I think that's largely true, except for the Paul's reference to the thorn in his flesh. Mm-hmm. There's some inner turmoil going on with his own conscience there. And I think it's a blessing to us that Paul doesn't mention what that is, because if he mentioned what it was, we would externalize it and say that has no relevance to me. But we all have thorns in our flesh that we have to deal with.
what's the name of the, John Shelby Spong wrote a book arguing that the thorn in his flesh was that he was actually gay, and that he was struggling with that throughout his whole life. I don't buy it. Stendhal argues that it was a physical malady, and that you can read this from the context about what he's talking about, because in that same passage, or even in that same book, he talks about how moral he is, that he's talking about the difficulty he's having and that we have with various afflictions, and that he believes, you could buy or not buy, he believes it's some sort of epilepsy or something like that. But again, that is, and people argue about Stendhal stuff to this day. It's in 1961. This affects anybody writing about Paul and the law, or Paul and any of these things, has to deal with what Stendhal argued. And so this is his argument. I'm going to finish the two other points and then go ahead and respond. Also in his writings, he says what I talked to you about before. Was Paul a convert to Christianity? No, he considered himself a Pharisaical Jew, Jewish person from birth until death. And he points out in a work in 1975 that when one of his last acts, Paul joined 4 Jewish people, this is Acts 21, who had begun following Christ. People usually say converts, but it's the same issue. It's a Jewish person who's going to the temple by going to the temple in Jerusalem to perform a rite of purification in Acts 21. So the thing is, people who say he converted away from Judaism to Christianity, why is he still going to the temple afterwards and doing rites of purification? And he goes around on several occasions after that fact. So he doesn't leave that. So what is he doing? Stendhal argues that we should not talk about a conversion, but about a, what were you going to say?
No, but call.
Yeah, that it was a call. That he thought actually that the Jewish faith had been completed with the Messiah. And that's what he was talking about. And it also opened the door to Gentiles becoming part of this, of the people of God. He didn't think they were switching, because when he changes in about the year 35 AD, there was no Christianity, okay? There was a bunch of Jesus followers and apostles in Jerusalem, but there wasn't any Christianity. And even in the year 60, there's no one calling this group Christians. They were Christ following Gentiles or Christ following Jews. And as I said, we need to remember when we read anything that he writes, he wrote all his letters to one group, and that is Christ following Gentiles. He never wrote a word that we have to Christ following Jews or non-Christ following Jews. We only have his words and how he thinks the law applies to Gentiles who follow Jesus. Okay? Just something to remember. So go ahead with what you're saying. So these are his 2 points. One, that Paul was different from what Luther was having, that he didn't have this internal issue like they did after confirmations created in the medieval Catholic society.
What I appreciate about Stendhal, I mean, he says we in the West are so caught up in the collective consciousness of the individual, and that gets bound into forgiveness. It's about me and Jesus and going to heaven. Where he says, Paul all talks about reconciliation, so it's relationship, it's community, it's connection.
And it's a word you like, covenant.
Absolutely.
That his focus is on, how do I know what you were thinking? Because we've done this dance before.
Reconciliation with the Jew.
No, but he says Paul's concern is about bringing, about the fact that the Messiah brought Gentiles into community with Jews. And that is, it's not so much a concern about my own internal sins, it's about making sure that we all become one. That's his argument. Again, people disagree with this. You can go online and find a lot of people saying, and this, the first one I told you is called the Lutheran perspective. And that's sort of unfortunate because Calvin said very much the same thing. And sometimes Calvin said it even better. So you'll find Reformed theologians and Lutheran theologians who say what I told you earlier about Luther is absolutely correct, and Stendhal was wrong. And then the second person, the most important probably theologian in the second half of the 20th century, E.P. Sanders, is wrong as well. And E.P. Sanders did something, and he went after the second part of the argument that Luther had. Okay, the second part is that the Catholic Church equals biblical Judaism. And when you look at biblical Judaism, you see the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. He sat down and did something that nothing we would do. And I read these books so you don't have to, but he read these books so I didn't have to. And he wrote a book called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and he read the Mishnah, and he read all of the old ancient Jewish books and writings to see what they thought about their faith, which was Stendhal's point: when interpreting and understanding another religion, you should go and see what that religion says about itself. Okay? So this is what he found out. That our understanding of Paul and first century Judaism is deeply flawed. Secondly, that Jews did not think people could simply earn God's saving action through good deeds. He says he found one example of that in the first century AD. Other people have said there are others who say this, but this is his argument. That many ancient Jewish people did not believe anyone could live a sinless life. So when we hear people talking about works righteousness and how you can earn God's favor, he said when you read them, they're not talking like that. That's critics of them saying that, but they don't actually say that about themselves. And then he quotes people, including from the Old Testament. There's no one who does not sin in 2 Chronicles or in 1 Enoch, a great book, very confusing book, as confusing as Revelation, written between the Old Testament and New Testament, about it affects very much how Jesus thinks, and it's quoted in what book? The very short book in the and is it in Titus? The first Enoch's quoted, and in there it says, "No one of the flesh can be just before the Lord," which sounds a whole lot like Romans 3. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God, right? So, but you find this before Romans wrote a word, before Paul wrote a word. So that idea is out there. Some Jews felt there was a righteous remnant, as they called about, sometimes a small 7, sometimes a small 70 or 10 that did fulfill the law, but that they thought the vast majority of ancient Jews were sinners and desperately needed God's unmerited grace and mercy. Again, who does this sound like? And then finally, early Judaism was neither legalistic nor a religion of works righteousness, but a system that we've never heard before of covenantal nomism. And so that makes the question come up, well, what is covenantal nomism? There I am. I knew you were going to ask. And this is what he found in reading what they were doing. And he's saying the law is there, they are following the law, but they don't have all the assumptions that we say ancient Jewish people. And I'll talk in the next group class about how when we say ancient Judaism, we're like really pushing a number of groups together, because there were Jews who believed in an afterlife, there were Jews who didn't believe in an afterlife. There were some Jews who thought the law applied mainly to priests, and there were some people who thought the law applied to everybody. There were people who believed in the resurrection, and there were Jews who didn't believe in the resurrection. There were Jews who believed you shouldn't defecate on a Sabbath. So there are, and that's the Dead Sea Scroll community felt that. And so there was a great deal of diversity. And when we start talking about first century Judaism, we're putting a lot of things together. But that's what he's trying to do. He's saying this is what he thinks an overwhelming belief of many Jews in the first century was. And that is, first, that God graciously chose Israel prior to any good works they had done. With Abraham, he chose the people and said, you will have a great people. And that's the start. And that's how they're elected and accepted, not because they did anything right or wrong. And then secondly, Israel responded to God's election with grateful and faithful law obedience. And the law is given, and you maintain a relationship. It's about a relationship, not about meriting salvation. So keeping the law is a relationship. You honor God by following what's in the law. And then 3, keeping the Jewish law was the right response to God's election of Israel. But what about the fact that we just read, many people felt that Jewish people didn't always fulfill the law? Well, the law deals with that. God gave Israel the merciful means to deal with sins and broken commandments through the cultic practices such as sacrifices at the temple and the Day of Atonement. A day when you sit, think about what you've done wrong for the last year, and then you ask for forgiveness about those things. These are things we forget when we're talking about Paul and what the law meant to him. So what do you think about this stuff? Go ahead.
One question. Covenantal Normanism, is the word love ever in there? I haven't heard the word love at all as a way of life, you know. The early Christians were known as the way, not as
Right.
a church. A way of faith active in love.
Right. I think what his point is we've done this thing where we've done law on one side versus grace. And he's saying grace is present with Jesus and how salvation occurs through Jesus, but grace was also present with the law. That God was gracious when he said, here's a means for us to be in relationship. So the interesting thing, and I'll talk about this again next time, sorry to keep on telling you this, maybe it'll be the time after that, but he's also going to argue that law is present over here. Because when he doesn't just talk about eliminating works altogether, if you look at 2 Corinthians 5:10, he says that at the end of time, Christ is going to judge us based on our works. So he's saying that when you accept Christ, or when Christ comes into your life at baptism, that you're then, essentially, the Spirit, the term is pneuma. Some people say pneuma, but in Greek the P is pronounced. The Spirit, and Spirit had a specific definition at this time. Stoics had an understanding of what Spirit was. It was one of the 5 elements that existed, and Paul was very much a Stoic philosopher. This pneuma, the Spirit within you, was like a steroid that allowed you to do good works. Okay? And so good works is very much a part of what you're doing. And you can find him saying the importance of works in Galatians. You can find the fruits of the
Spirit.
pneuma is... So law is going on back there and going on after you become a Christian. And grace was going on back there, and grace is going on now for Christians. So that's what Sanders was arguing. So what was the result of this idea when he published this book? Boom. You can't find a book on Paul that doesn't say E.P. Sanders is brilliant and I dedicate my career to him, or E.P. Sanders doesn't know what he's talking about. You have to deal with him. Go ahead.
Okay, when I see that word graciously,
Yeah.
I translate it in my thinking to God lovingly chose Israel. So grace is love. So
Yeah.
all this stuff with Israel, with Israelites, was God's love working through the covenantal
Exactly.
relationship.
And what I want you to think about too is Sanders wasn't saying Luther was a terrible person. I think he thinks the framework was usable, the law versus grace, but he was saying law, he's just changing the middle word to law and grace. So it's not one against the other that you're dealing with. And so he says keep that, because grace was going on back there, but the law was very important. And if you read the law is done lovingly, but it's also pretty stern, and there's stuff that we would never do that's in the law. But he was saying this is the main attitude you'll find in ancient Judaism about the law. And we've been misreading it all this time through the Lutheran perspective. And we need to expand our understanding of that, okay? And again, Sanders, who died just last year, he's come here twice to give his talk. He's Methodist, in fact. And he thought, I shouldn't just write what I think, I should sit down and write this stuff. And in the 90s, he decided to deal with Jesus and wrote a book on what he thought Jesus believed. Again, a very powerful book, but not like this. And so this has led to actually 3 different views. But the Lutheran view is continued, that we talked about. I would call it the traditional view. The traditional Protestant view is continued. But there have been other views that have emerged. And one's called the new perspective on Paul. One's by, and the two leading guys on this, James J.D. Dunn and N.T. Wright, Tom Wright. Tom Wright's a bishop of Durham in England, a pretty conservative guy, and actually a critic of people reevaluating these perspectives based on what happened in the Holocaust. He's written some unfortunate things about that, but he took these things that we saw in Kircher Stendhal and in Singenders, and they moved it somewhat forward. You can decide if you agree or disagree with this. They believe that Paul's problem with Judaism was that it was ethnocentric or exclusive as opposed to being universal, not that it was legalistic. Okay, and he's saying that they had these markers that kept Gentiles from becoming followers of God. That when he attacks the work of the law in Galatians, he's not opposing general good works. When he says that you're not going to be able to do these works of the law, he means you're not going to be able to, in particular, you're not going to be able to engage in the rite of circumcision. And Paul believed that you could only do appropriate circumcision on the 8th day. After that time, you were just hurting yourself. It wasn't anything, you weren't benefiting anything, you were just sticking a knife to yourself. And so it was of no worth. If you do it on the 8th day, then you're a Jew. After that time, you're not. And he says that you guys shouldn't be following Sabbath observance or following the kosher food laws. And he argued that Jews were misusing the law not just for ethnic pride, but keep Gentiles from God's saving action. So his writings, they say, are including all this stuff, and he's saying, if you're a follower of Christ, don't do any of this stuff, okay? And that opens and makes following Christ a universal thing. It's not just a minor thing. And then central to his is what you were talking about. They have an emphasis on covenant, and they believe justification through faith is mainly about covenant, not about personal sin. Central to Paul's gospel is bringing Jew and Gentile together in common worship of God, making them two united into one humanity and reconciling them. And then finally, the problem in their minds with ancient Judaism was, as Wright says, race, not grace. It's not the issue of grace or laws or legalism. It's the fact that they have these things that establish them as a separate people. And he's saying we should open that up and make it available to everybody. Okay? This is called the New Perspective. You can go online and read videos. In fact, I have one, but we're not having enough time, so I'm going to drop it. But we're going to go to the final thing, the final group, which is the radical New Perspective on Paul, which has emerged with writers like Lloyd Gaston, Pamela Eisenbaum, and Paul Gager. This group emphasizes that Paul was not a Christian. In fact, that's the title of Eisenbaum's book, but was a Jewish person until his death. But some of the people in this group believe he quit observing the law. Paul must be understood within first century Judaism, not against it. And then this is the interesting part. According to this school of thought, Paul thought Jewish people were saved via the Torah and Gentiles by Christ, leading to the fact that there are two covenants. Their argument is Jews don't need Jesus. Only Gentiles do. Okay, it's called the two covenant of, and there's actually people who have a three covenant view. But then, this is Gaston. Had all Israel followed Paul's example, we would have had an Israel loyal to the righteousness of God expressed in the Torah alongside the Gentile church, which expressed itself through Jesus Christ and his fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. So we have two covenants out there. Okay? And just a hint, I don't believe this is in the Bible. But this is their perspective and very popular right now because it makes it easy. You don't have to convert anybody. They've already got the law. But there are problems with both of these schools of thought, in my perspective. You probably have thought of some already. First, if the Jews did not need Christ, what was Peter doing when he was the apostle to the Jews? He wasn't reminding them to do Torah. The Pharisees were around to do that. He was preaching Christ, but what was the purpose of that? And Paul dedicated his life to preaching Jesus. Did that mean that he thought Jesus was completely irrelevant for all Jews? Another one, all of these schools seem to think that there was something wrong with Jews, okay? The Luther thought that they were legalistic. Dunn and Wright believes that they're exclusive. But is it possible that they were not, that Paul didn't think there was anything fundamentally wrong with them, just that they didn't have the Messiah, and he was preaching that to them to teach the whole lesson? And what do you think Paul would have been saying to Jewish people in his own day? So I told you, we have no letters at all to Jewish people. We have a brief conversation in Acts 15, and we have him talking about in Romans 9 through 11 what he would have been saying to Jews, but he says he's all things to all people. What was he actually telling Christ following Jews at that time? And then this question, justification by faith is very important to Paul, okay? And whatever perspective you take, you have to understand what that means. And what does it mean? Each of these groups have different views of what it means. But, Luther was right that justification by faith is very important to Paul. But if you're part of the new perspective, what does it mean? If you're part of the radical perspective, or the community I'll talk about next week, the Paul within ancient Judaism school, what does it mean in those? And then Paul thought, and I told you this at the very beginning, he thought Jesus was returning before he died. If you remove that element from him, how would that affect his teachings? Because Jesus didn't come back, okay? In other words, if Paul were alive today, what would he be telling us about Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians? What would he be telling us? In other words, what would Paul be saying now? Okay? And next week, I'm going to talk about another school. And this is the one that I generally agree to, and you guys can disagree. These are three of the scholars in it. And the right, it's Matthew Thiessen, Paula Fredrickson, a former Catholic who became Jewish through her study of these issues, and Robin Faith Walsh, who's at the University of Miami. She's very big, and actually a school of people who went to Brown University have been emphasizing this idea of pneuma, spirit, as being the key element of what Paul is teaching. The importance of spirit and what God's Spirit does for us and how it works in our lives. So what do you think of these things? It's not what you learned in confirmation class, was it?
Wow.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think when we think of Gentiles, we think of Christian Gentiles.
Yeah.
We talk about this, and Gentiles are really everybody. And I think Paul's actual message was that God chose humanity. And
the fact is, Paul was ethnocentric in his own way. Instead of, like today, if we would refer to ourselves as Lutherans and then everybody else, that would be, we would not be treating other groups respectfully today. But in his day, Greeks did this too. I don't know if you know where the term barbarism comes from. The Greeks said there are the Greeks, the brilliant, the intelligent, beautiful Greeks, and then there are those who speak like bar. We don't have to understand what they're saying, and they're the barbar. That's barbarism. Two schools of people. Jews did this in their own time, and in fact, Jews said there's us, and then there's they sometimes called them the ethne, the other groups, sometimes called them the nations, and sometimes called them the Gentiles. It's all the same. But an important thing in understanding who Paul is, Paul believed that the end times would only come when members of the ethne joined the Jewish followers of God. And he thought when Christ came, that means the ethne conversion process, the ethne people turning to God would start. And he thought it was through Christ that people would start accepting what's in the law, and that very soon that the end of times would come, the parousia. So he did not believe that only Jewish people would be saved in the end. He believed, and he thought it was his role to go out and help tell this message to to Gentiles, and he had a plan. He had a plan to go from where he was to the east, to the center, and then when he dies, he's planning to go to Rome and then to Spain. He was trying to cover the whole area of the known world to him. But you're right, there's this division that goes on, and actually the Old Testament in Genesis 10 talks about there being 70 nations, so it's a little more sophisticated than what Paul did. Another interesting thing is in Romans 1:18 through 32, Paul talks about how horrible Gentiles are, and I think he fundamentally believes Gentiles are less moral, are more immoral than Jews are, because they didn't have the law. And therefore, they did all sorts of horrible things that that Jews would never think to do. But it's only through Christ that they will be able to turn that around and be able to do the works of the law.
To that point, was that just prejudice, or were Gentiles?
I think you can find that throughout 1st century, 2nd century, all sorts of in ancient Jewish writing. There was just this belief that we were superior, that we had the law, so we knew what was right, so we could do it. The Gentiles don't have the law. There are a few who follow the law. They're called God-fearers. But for the most part, he says in Romans 1 that they were given over to their own flesh. They were allowed to, they started and it's all because they followed idols. Because they followed idols, that led them to value themselves and to follow their own moral guide and avoid what the law said.
This is way off base. Could you do a presentation on Elon Musk and the end times?
No, completely different from Ross. We're thinking about teaching a class, and David's going to do it too. Maybe two on
What the world's coming to.
on Gaza, and what's going on there. And would you guys be interested in this?
Oh, yeah.
So what we're thinking about is doing two classes. One with someone, with a leader in the Muslim community coming in, and David would talk to him. David's been to Gaza on 3 or 4 occasions, and has specific views about Palestinians and Jewish people in there. And then I'll bring in a friend of mine who's a leader in the Jewish community, and we'll talk about what's going on there from his perspective. Are you guys interested in this? And then finally, don't forget about the trip to, and I waited too long on this, but to remind you, if you are interested in the trip to Greece, this is more what I talked about today. I'm going to sort of flesh out in another class, but then I want to end with Jesus versus Paul and how these two fit together, because it's not always clear when Jesus is asked in Mark, how do I reach the kingdom of God? He has a particular answer to that, and the answer that he gives is not the answer that we believe. We don't teach what he says, and so I want to put those two together. How do we put what Jesus says about salvation and what Paul says about salvation? How those two connect?
Amen.
So is this interesting? This stuff?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.